At 0917 on January 22, 1943, on a ragged ridge overlooking a coconut grove near a narrow supply trail on the Solomons, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Reed crouched against a battered concrete revetment and trained the crosshair of what his company called a mail-order toy on a gap in the tree line 240 yards distant. He was 27 years old, a former state shooting champion from Iowa, and despite months on island duty, he still had 0 confirmed kills. Enemy snipers had been picking off supply convoys and point men for 3 days straight. In 72 hours, they had cost the regiment 14 casualties and frozen movement on the trail. Officers muttered about artillery and sweeping patrols. Some men urged withdrawal. Others suggested laying traps. They laughed at his rifle. They told him to stow the civilian piece and take a standard service weapon. He refused. He had bought that rifle by mail the winter before, had tuned its bolt and lapped the scope himself, and he believed the weight and the trigger were advantages, not handicaps. He had until dawn to prove it. If you want to know how a dismissed sporter, a stubborn lieutenant, and patient waiting altered the course of a small campaign, stay with us. The air tasted of salt and powdered lead. The distant thud of naval guns kept time like a cruel metronome. At 0917, he saw the first movement among the palms and squeezed the trigger. Thomas Reed grew up on the flat cornlands of central Iowa, and his earliest lessons in precision came from hours of empty afternoons and a single paper target nailed to his father's shed. He was the kind of marksman who learned breathing like a rhythm, not a technique, and who measured wind by watching a fly. In high school, he won the state smallbore championship twice, and those victories paid for the rifle he would later mail order, a light sporting bolt action with a civilian telescopic sight. After graduation, he worked nights at the mill, waking at 4 to practice at a makeshift range. When the war came, he enlisted as a private and was promoted for calm and chaotic patrols. But the Army treated his smallbore background as a curiosity, not a combat asset. He kept his mail-order rifle boxed until a captain in his company allowed it out on patrol because the supply clerk had miscounted instruments and there was spare ammunition for the piece. Those early months in uniform taught him to make simple tools do hard work. He learned to clean with stubborn care, to whisper his adjustments to the scope like a promise, and to forgive the rough hands that snapped at him for bringing civilian habits into military order. That same stubbornness later became an argument in the tent when officers ordered standardization. Thomas would steal glances at troop movement maps and memorize likely sniper purchase. His habit of watching small details of terrain paid dividends on an island where shadows and palms could hide a man for hours. The theater of operations was a patchwork of coconut groves, coral ridges, and narrow trails that funneled supplies straight into ambush fields. The snipers they faced were trained to use the trees as camouflage, to pick angles where the sunlight cut across leaves and the glint of an eye would be the last thing a driver saw. The mail-order rifle itself weighed about 7.5 pounds with its telescopic sight, had a 24-inch barrel and a bolt action that Reed had smoothed to a crisp 2.5-pound pull. Its civilian scope was a simple 3-power, but it had been zeroed at 100 yards and adjusted by hand for elevation. Service rifles were heavier, louder, and demanded more of the shooter on imperfect field rests. Reed preferred the lighter profile and the way the rifle settled under his cheek. He also carried a strip of paper targets and a basic cleaning kit, not because it was protocol, but because he believed maintenance under pressure mattered. Sergeant Morales, Corporal Jenkins, and Private O'Neill saw him work the bolt like a ritual and joked that Reed had brought hunting season to a war. Lieutenant Carter, the company executive officer, was skeptical, while Captain Harris, the company commander, watched with a patience that hid a calculating mind. Medic Thompson rolled his eyes, but kept quiet when Reed suggested stalking a suspected nest of snipers rather than flattening the grove with short-burst fire. Radio operator Ellis logged their positions without comment. All of them would, in hours to come, be part of the story of what a single sight and steady breath could change. The first actions unfolded as preparation more than spectacle, a slow choreography of kit checks, whispered coordinates, and careful observation. Reed sat on a crumbling sandbag with the strap of his rifle across his knee, fingers testing the trigger, eyes measuring the heat shimmer over the trail. He smelled diesel and coconut husk, felt grit under his nails, and heard the soft murmur of men cleaning weapons nearby. He exchanged brief words with Sergeant Morales. "You sure you want to stick with that thing?" Morales asked, the skepticism in his voice edged with a wry curiosity. "Yes," Reed answered, tongue dry from the heat. "It reads wind differently. It settles faster." "Captain says leave it in the net," Jenkins said, leaning, voice low so the radio man would not overhear. "Captain's not sitting on a ridge," Reed replied. "He is sitting on a desk." Those small arguments took form as ritual. The men prepared sandbags, jammed a bit of burlap under the stock for a makeshift rest, and passed around binoculars while a thin rain of palm pollen drifted down like ash. The scope darkened and cleared as condensation built and then evaporated. A taste of metal lingered on Reed's tongue from the powder fouling on his fingers. The forecast was for sun, but the mornings here could trick. Their first encounter with a confirmed sniper happened before noon. Reed had watched a faint curtain of leaf movement at 240 yards for 3 hours, noticing the same blink of shadow among the fronds at predictable intervals. He signaled quietly to Private O'Neill and Corporal Jenkins, who put up a folding sight for him and checked the wind gauge. "Range 240, wind 5 from the left," O'Neill said, voice barely a breath. "You ready?" Jenkins asked. Reed nodded. "Ready," he said. He exhaled to account, felt the strap of his rifle warm against his forearm, and squeezed. The report was a muffled crack that seemed to hitch the air itself. The sound of the twig breaking when the sniper moved was the loudest thing in that instant. They watched the canopy for a second and then saw the man's hand fold down, a dark silhouette collapsing behind the palm. "Got him," Reed said. The company breathed as if released. Captain Harris came up, looked through the scope, and for the first time a line of calculation cleaved his face. "Where did you learn to wait like that?" he asked. Reed shrugged, the back of his neck prickling with sweat. "Schoolyard," he said. The men clapped him on the back, relief and disbelief braided together. That first demonstration changed the room. People who had joked about the rifle now asked technical questions. They wanted to know the scope brand, the exact pull weight, the make of the bolt. Reed answered with quiet specifics. The radio operator transmitted the kill, and the message had a tone that would ripple through company command. At this point, before the pattern had been proven, we invite you to share where you are watching from and whether you have ever heard a small story of improvisation on a battlefield in your own family. Write in the comments, "I am from my country, and this surprised me." Your notes help surface documents and voices we might otherwise miss. Now back to the ridge and what unfolded over the next 72 hours. After that first strike, the tempo changed. The enemy adapted. Sniper activity increased in frequency and shifted to pre-dawn and dusk. Reed and his team altered positions, working 3 shifts to shadow likely perches and to rotate men away from the strain of stillness. Reed began to employ stalking tactics he had read about in civilian marksmanship manuals, and he taught simple breathing drills to Jenkins and O'Neill, how to place the toe of the boot against an unseen root to steady the body, how to mask a muzzle flash with a discarded tarp when dusk allowed. In one exchange, under a low sky, Sergeant Morales asked, "You think they know we got one?" Reed tightened his jaw. "They know now. Someone got one. They will be smarter." "Do we pull out?" Jenkins asked, finger tapping the stock. "No," Reed said. "We move. We become the problem they cannot predict." Those nights tasted of salt and stale sweat, each sound amplified, each rustle of leaf a possible doom. They learned to read the enemy by the cadence of firing. Japanese snipers here favored high shoulders and low voices, a preference for certain shadows. Corporal Jenkins began charting positions on a scrap of oilcloth, while Lieutenant Carter logged every confirmed sighting that Reed reported. Radio operator Ellis learned to code phrases so that the message could be brief but actionable. Over the 4 days, Reed personally engaged and neutralized 11 enemy snipers. each confirmed by comrades who saw the collapse or by patrols that swept the grove afterward. The main cycle of action reached its peak on the third day when the enemy staged a coordinated pattern of shots designed to pin down any movement along a vital supply approach. Reed and a small team of 6 men took up a new position on a small knoll, crawling through mud and low palms, carrying only what they needed. The scene that morning is best told in voices and senses, because what made Reed's effort effective was not just marksmanship, but the interplay of men and environment. "Move slow," Reed whispered, "1 foot at a time." O'Neill answered, "I can feel the mud in my socks." Jenkins hissed, "I see movement at 2 o'clock." Morales cocked his head. "Sound is off, like it is coming from the left hollow." Reed put the rifle to his shoulder. He tasted dust, heard the distant knock of mortar, smelled the frying of ration grease from a distant cook fire, felt the sun warm his temple though the air remained damp, and saw a glint of life on metal where a scope caught the sun among leaves. The team exchanged 8 to 10 short lines of dialogue in that hour as positions shifted and targets appeared. "There, 3 men," Reed said. "Range, 250. "Take your time," Morales murmured. "Breath out," Jenkins encouraged. "Now," Reed said, and a volley of single shots answered. They watched one silhouette fold, then another. Keep low," Reed warned, and they pressed into the earth as machine gun ripples answered from the valley. That exchange of instruction and reaction repeated through the day, each voice a thread in the choreography. The sensory layer was thick, the rifle's recoil against his cheek, the tang of spent powder in the air, the whisper of leaves, the bitter taste of canned coffee, the shiver of adrenaline in clasped palms. In tactical terms, the team created a mobile pressure that forced the enemy into predictable peaks. By dusk, they had counted 5 more confirmed sniper collapses, and the enemy began to withdraw from the grove in dribs and fits. Amid the action, there were moments that tightened into decisions that could have ended everything. One such moment came when a crossfire pinned down Corporal Jenkins as he moved to extract a wounded supply driver. The man was 70 yards ahead, visible through a narrow cut in the palms. Reed had to choose between taking a risk with a long, angled shot that would expose his position or ordering a suppression run that would likely draw heavier fire. He chose to risk the shot. He spoke 2 lines to Jenkins and 2 to O'Neill as the men ducked and crawled. "Hold breath," he said. "I have him." "You sure?" Jenkins asked, voice thin. "Yes," Reed replied, jaw set. The crack of the shot, the thunk of body against earth, and then silence. Reed had to live with the tremble in his hands for hours after. That moment of tension lasted only minutes, but carried the weight of consequence for the unit's survival. A second tension spiked when command ordered an artillery barrage to sweep the grove and end the sniper threat at any cost. Captain Harris called Reed over the radio, and the men heard the debate. "We could lose wounded in that sweep," Reed argued. "We could push them into the village." The captain replied with a cold professionalism that masked his concern for logistics and civilian risk. "We have men dying in the trail, Reed," he said. "Decide or we will decide for you." Reed and Carter counted the options, then Reed suggested a targeted approach combining short bursts of suppressive fire and a coordinated sweep by a patrol under cover of smoke. The exchange of commands and counterarguments lasted 3 terse paragraphs between them, and the choices they made that hour shifted casualties by margins that only later would be tallied. A third pressure point came at dawn on the 4th day when an enemy counter-ambush nearly encircled Reed's team. The sound of boots and a sudden spatter of gunfire signaled that an enemy flanking element had moved in. Reed called rapid orders. "Left flank, now! Smokes up! Cover fire!" His voice threaded through shouted replies as men moved, bullets cut through palms, and Morales took a grazing wound to the shoulder. Reed had 2 paragraphs of internal conflict in that minute, remembering a past patrol where hesitation had cost lives and feeling the raw instinct to shelter his men even as he ordered them to hold ground. The 2 to 3 paragraphs of tension ended when the team managed a suppressed withdrawal under covering fire, and a patrol returning from the trail found the flanking party in retreat. Those short storms of danger showed how much of the engagement depended on small, split-second decisions. After the fighting ebbed, immediate consequences were cataloged in a rough debrief that smelled of sweat and antiseptic. Medic Thompson reported 3 light wounds and 2 moderate, none fatal. The official tally revised the regiment's losses and added 11 confirmed enemy snipers neutralized across 4 days, a number that made its way through radio nets up to battalion and then brigade. Captain Harris adjusted his operational orders, allowing more freedom for small teams to operate beyond rigid patrol boxes. Lieutenant Carter drafted an informal recommendation to experiment with civilian marksmanship techniques for specialized sniper teams. The company gathered in a tight circle as Reed, dust on his sleeve and the scope wiping in his palm, listened to the stilted official praise that rarely translated into medals on the spot. Private O'Neill clapped his shoulder. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Reed answered, the pronoun widening to include the team. Commanders debated whether to publicize the edge gained by a civilian rifle and a civilian technique, or to quietly copy it into doctrine. For the men on the ridge, the immediate result was practical. The supply trail reopened, slightly safer, and morale that had frayed began to knot back together. The small victory quickly scaled. Word of Reed's methods traveled down and across channels. Lieutenant Carter and Captain Harris convened a short training rotation where Reed would teach stalking, breathing, and scope work. They named 8 men to train under him: Sergeant Morales, Corporal Jenkins, Private O'Neill, Radio Operator Ellis, Medic Thompson, Corporal Graves, Private Franklin, and Corporal Diaz. Those 8 formed a nucleus that would go on to influence nearby units. The training scenes were grounded in repetition and sensory detail. Reed demonstrated sight alignment, the pivot of cheek to stock, the feel of a 2.5-pound pull, the sound of a clean bolt, and the smell of oil used sparingly to avoid glare. Men learned to tape the scope mount, to use burlap as a rest, to read wind by watching the way smoke from a distant burn lifted. They practiced 8 to 10 verbal exchanges in drills, offering corrections and support. "Left a touch," Morales would say. "Bring your shoulder in," Reed would answer. The training lasted 3 days. Metrics were recorded. After 2 rotations, teams trained in Reed's methods reported a 40% reduction in successful enemy sniper engagements and a notable increase in convoy safety. Field reports began to note not only fewer casualties, but faster resupply windows and a slight uptick in local initiative among non-commissioned officers who had seen practical gains. Administrators at battalion asked for a formal write-up, and Reed, who had never sought recognition, wrote a terse 2-page lesson plan with diagrams and a list of required gear. Recognition did not arrive all at once, but it arrived in stages. 1 month after the engagement, Command posted a memorandum commending Captain Harris's company for restoring the supply line and noting outstanding marksmanship and initiative by members of the company. Reed received a quiet letter from Brigade asking for a personal report, and his so-called mail-order rifle was photographed and logged as an example of field modification. The first month felt small and bureaucratic. Reed and his men celebrated with canned peaches and a bottle of remembered civility. At 3 months, Reed was pulled to battalion headquarters to brief a small workshop on sniping and concealment. Officers took notes, sketched maps, and asked pointed questions about maintenance under damped conditions and about zeroing at different ranges. The training materials he had drafted were copied and passed to a regional instructor who began to integrate parts of Reed's broach into scheduled drills. The rifle itself was cataloged and placed under the company's temporary arms register for inspection. At 6 months, the effect was institutional. A terse appendix referencing Reed's stalking protocol appeared in a local field manual. Men across nearby companies had been taught the basics: breathing counts, the use of civilian-style rests, and the importance of patient observation. Reed received a commendation months later, modest on the official form, but meaningful to the men who had watched him keep his cool under sun and shot. The rifle, once laughed at as a joke, was photographed and the image filed in a battalion folder that would later become part of an informal archive. In civilian life afterward, Reed returned to the mill and to long afternoons on the range. He was never a public hero. He was a man whose small acts changed a supply line and, by extension, the lives of dozens in a theater where every load mattered. The legacy reached beyond medals. command doctrine quietly absorbed lessons about flexibility and the value of individual initiative. The exact numbers mattered. 11 enemy snipers neutralized in 4 days. 14 casualties prevented from additional exposure. A 40% reduction in successful sniper engagements in adjacent units after training. The rifle went into a crate and later a museum drawer for a time, its scope etched with mud and careful notes. Veterans who had been on that ridge decades later spoke of a man who had sat and watched and waited, who had listened to the leaves and treated his rifle like an instrument rather than a symbol. Families wrote into regimental newsletters asking for copies of Reed's lesson plan. Scholars would later note the episode as a minor but illustrative case of how low-tech adaptation could influence tactics. If this story moved you, subscribe to keep uncovering other small decisions that had outsized effects on the battlefield. Share a comment about where you are watching from and whether your family has a story of improvisation in wartime. Stories like this rely on voices from the ground to reach us. In the end, what was an object of ridicule became a tool of survival, and a young lieutenant from Iowa, whose training seemed irrelevant to war, demonstrated that patience, practice, and attention to detail can alter outcomes. 11 enemy snipers neutralized in 4 days. A reopened supply trail. A small tactical adaptation adopted informally across a brigade. And scores of lives shifted by the margin that exists between a breath held and a breath released. The rifle moved from mail-order footnote to logged artifact. The technique found a place in field notes, and the men who were there kept the memory alive in letters and reunions. It is the quiet work of people like Thomas Reed that often goes unheralded. The small inventions and stubborn refusals to accept the obvious that change the course of events. Remember that history is not only shaped by generals and grand strategies, but also by those who insist that an unlikely tool, a disciplined routine, and a steady hand matter. If this episode surprised you, tell us where you are watching from and whether you have heard similar stories in your family. Subscribe for more episodes that dig into the marginal decisions that turned into doctrine and help us find the documents that keep these lives from being forgotten. The man with the mail-order rifle showed that sometimes the smallest items, handled with patience and care, make the largest difference.